Hi everyone, welcome to the Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm Katie Brackett-Fialka, and today I'm talking with Scott Nesbitt, who is an assistant professor of historic preservation and history at the University of Georgia, and Andrew Fialka, who is a PhD student at the University of Georgia. They're here to talk to us today about their current project, which is entitled Civil War GIS. Basically, they're mapping all the engagements of the Civil War. So before we go any further, why don't you guys just tell us a little bit about your project?
This project started, Andrew and I had been talking a little bit, and I'd done some things with digital history before. Visualized Emancipation is a project that I built with Ed Ayers at the University of Richmond. I was looking at where enslaved people were becoming free during the war and how they were engaging with U.S. soldiers. And in order to do that, I had to figure out where the soldiers were. This led me to start looking at Dyer's compendium, Frederick Dyer's Compendium of the War of the Rebellion, which has been digitized by Tufts University, their Perseus project. So they have all of this text there, and so then the question is how to figure out where soldiers were based on it.
So I used a digital mapping program called ArcGIS, very popular in geography and geology and historic preservation. Basically what ArcGIS allows us to do is to load all the data of where the Union Army was onto a map, and then the map can actually go through time. You can control what day of the war you're looking at. And you can not only see where these engagements of the Civil War are happening, we can see when they're happening, and then any other data that's available on the internet to us for the war years, we can lay over that map as well.
Okay.
So we've looked at not only what soldiers are doing and where they're doing it, but where they're doing it in relation to slavery, in relation to population centers, in relation to transportation networks, things like that.
I'm not sure if you're, how many of your subscribers and the people watching this video are familiar with the source that we're working with, but Frederick Dyer's Compendium of the War of the Rebellion that allows us to get at all of this stuff. He was a drummer boy in the U.S. Army. He was 14 or so when he ran away to the Union Army. It was just after the Battle of Gettysburg. This guy had, I don't know if obsessive is the right word. Maybe it is.
Yes.
An obsessive devotion to knowing and understanding where everybody went during the war. And he had this encyclopedic memory that led him, he was a traveling salesman after the war. And so when he'd go around to all these towns, he'd go to the GAR posts, the veterans posts, and he'd ask people what unit they were in. And folks would tell him, and then he would proceed to tell them all the places that they went over the course of the war. And people, it gave everybody a chuckle. And his friends kept telling him, you got to write this down. You got to write this down. Well, so finally, he, in 1904 or so, he goes into his study with a copy of the official records of the War of the Rebellion and some other papers and his typewriter, and brings his cot in and emerged 5 years later or so with this Compendium of the War of the Rebellion, which, as you said, tracks all of the places that the regiments went, what the skirmishes and all of these things were, and who fought in them, and tracks all the commanders of all the regiments. And so we've kind of used this data set to try to get a hold on the geography of the war.
Very cool. So based on what you're seeing on the map, for the typical soldier, what type of engagement or battle would they be most likely to experience?
What we found out was that Dyer recorded about 12,000 violent engagements of the war, and less than 1% of those were battles.
Wow.
While over half of those, so over 6,000, were small skirmishes. The rest were things like expeditions and raids and reconnaissance missions. And so while the numbers of troops engaged in a battle, and certainly the blood spilled out of battle, is larger than in all these other types of engagements, soldiers are still doing these other things a vast majority of the time. They're almost always either moving or in camp or engaging in something small, on a small violent encounter.
Very interesting.
So what our analysis of these different types of engagements that soldiers were active in kind of tells us is that past couple decades there's been something called the new military history. It's a turn in military history where scholars are focusing more on the home front. They're focusing more on guerrilla studies, on occupation, and this data sort of backs those scholars up and says, well, that's a little more typical of what those soldiers were doing. And so it is more representative of the soldier experience. And we've also discovered that most of the war happened in places that didn't want the war in the first place, or were very, very neutral. Missouri and Tennessee, people don't often think about a whole lot. Those were right behind Virginia, where most of the war took place. Those border states really saw the most destruction of the whole entire war.
What are your plans moving forward? What would you like to see this information be used for? Do you guys have plans for it?
The first thing that we have to do is actually finish figuring out where all of these places are. So this is one of the challenges of moving from text to map, is that Frederick Dyer records a place name, right? Thompson's Plantation, South Carolina. Well, we have to figure out where Thompson's Plantation was exactly. It's around Charleston somewhere, but to get it, to pinpoint it with some accuracy is going to take a lot of time. I think we've figured out where, more than half. We have a ways to go on actually figuring out where all these places are. I think we've figured out where, more than half, but we have a ways to go on actually figuring out where all these places are. So that's the first step. We're also starting to analyze it, and we'll probably publish some boring scholarly articles. Well, hopefully they won't be too boring, but we'll publish in some journals, and then hopefully also release a website that would allow a tool that would allow everybody to come on, track where any old regiment went during the war. Track all the battles, and try to get a much more detailed sense of where the Civil War was actually fought.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for talking to me today about this, and I look forward to seeing where the scholarship goes.
Thanks very much, Katie.
Thanks, Katie.
All right.